for his numerous publications. Mark has written extensively about Cappadocian Greek. In fact, Mark and Dimitris Papazachariou discovered the speakers of Cappadocian Greek when everybody thought that Cappadocian became extinct. They discovered them in Greece and they made very important studies. It's not an exaggeration to say that it's essentially Dawkins on Cappadocian and then Mark's works. And what is also very important is that he also paved this avenue for newer researchers to work on Cappadocian. In fact, we're just waiting for a very exciting database of Cappadocian dialects. None of that would have been made possible if it wasn't for Mark's work. So it is a great pleasure to be able to welcome Mark. I'm omitting all other information about numerous visiting professorships, fellowships, because I'd rather focus on the real substance, and the real substance is actually the study of Greek in all its forms. So Mark, welcome again to Cambridge and again, and we very much look forward to your talk today.
Thank you very much for these very friendly and flattering words. Thank you for coming. There are a number of people I would like to thank particularly because it came from remote places like Oxford. Actually, as a real successor to Richard Dawkins, who holds the chair with probably the longest name in any university ever. The former ambassador of Greece to Belgium made it to Cambridge, so and I see a number of very dear friends, so that's a real pleasure. I'm going to talk about Cappadocian, as you know, and at the request of my dear friend Adam, I will focus on a number of aspects that distinguish Cappadocian from other modern Greek dialects. So that's what I've been working on, and it actually works, right? Yeah. So this is a map of the ancient Greek dialects, which, as you can see, are divided into three main groups, depending on the theory, because there are different theories on the groupings of these dialects. We only see here the dialects of the Aegean and the Ionian Sea. And if we move to the modern Greek dialects, then you probably know that they are not located in this area alone. There are dialects to be found in other areas as well. Also very important to keep in mind is that the relationship between the modern Greek dialects and the ancient Greek dialects is a very indirect one, to say the least. For almost all of the modern dialects, there is no direct connection with any of the ancient dialects, with a few possible exceptions, but I don't be talking about these. What we have to take into consideration is that because these dialects evolved in territories which were inhabited by certain and I talk and stuff at the same time. Do you want me to
just carry on? I've got a technical issue.
Okay. What I was saying is we have to take into consideration that these dialects evolved in areas where ancient dialects used to be spoken. So in several cases, it is possible to find traces of this ancient substrate, dialectal substrate, so to speak, in the present-day forms of the dialect. And this is especially the case in Southern Italian dialects, but also in the dialects that we are working on, Joanna and myself, Romaica and Cappadocian and Asia Minor. This is a map of the colonization, Greek colonization, so you can see the spread of the Greeks over the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. And this explains why we find Greek dialects even today in places where there was, once were original Greek settlements. This is a map of the breaking up of the Roman Empire in Western and Eastern Empire. And as you can see, there is, that's called the political boundary, but the dotted line is the linguistic boundary. And you can see on this map that Well, Greek, this is basically the Greek-speaking area of the Eastern Byzantine Empire. Just for historical sake, I gave a talk about the translation of the Pentateuch, which was done in Alexandria in the 3rd century BC. A few people were present in my talk yesterday. The reason was that Greek was so important that the Jews who were so thoroughly Hellenized couldn't understand the Hebrew or the Aramaic, which they initially wrote with language. And that is why this translation was done in Greek. The same for the New Testament and the epistles, who were translated and circulated in Greek. And here we have the area we will be concentrating on, especially with Pontus lying here in the north, and especially for Adam, I also encircled the southern part of Italy, where up to the present day, modern Greek dialects are spoken. Here on Calabria, we have conference in October, and in Puglia, more specifically in Salento, where my future daughter-in-law is coming from. But she's not a native speaker of Greek, she speaks Salentino, but not the Greek. Salentino is difficult to know. So this is a map, of the modern Greek dialects, which shows you the traditional division between northern and southern dialects. There is another map which was drawn up by Peter Trudgill, which gives you an idea of some very important isoglosses. In the northern part, you see the word for skili, which is pronounced skli, because in these northern dialects, there are two important phenomena: the raising of unstressed e to I and unstressed o to u, and as a corollary of that, the deletion of unstressed I and U in unstressed syllables, which means that Thessaloniki would be pronounced Thessaloniki, according to these rules. There's another important isogloss in the north, the Northern Greek dialects, which includes the personal pronouns. The object-clitic pronouns are the same for direct and indirect objects. So you have the accusative for both cases, which leads to these jokes about the Northern Greeks saying something like "Sameanixis piso kiria or the bus when you want to leave through the back door." This can lead to multiple interpretations. There are other isoglosses here. You see the Tibetan Moss area where Kiriaki is pronounced Chiriachi, and here a more characterized version Chiriachi. Here is an area where the final N is preserved due to diminutives. So instead of Tirin, this is something you find in Pontic and Romania as well. There is an area where you have geminate consonants, which you also find in Cypriot Greek, especially. But most of these phenomena you also find in other dialects, which are not included in these isoglosses because they are, in a literal sense, peripheral dialects, which to a certain extent have developed independently of the core dialects, which you see here. According to the Academy of Adams, that was this is a division between different types of dialects, which is this is the traditional division in Greece, where you have real dialecti, real dialects, and a number of idiomata. In English, I think you could compare it with the distinction between traditional dialects and accents, more or less. One can debate about the inclusion of any one of these dialects, but maybe Cretan is something which people might wonder whether it's a dialect, or it depends on how high up in the mountains you go, I suppose. Some of the other peripheral dialects are considered to be separate languages by some linguists. I would be definitely inclined to consider a number of them as Hellenic languages, just as we talk about Italian and Spanish and Portuguese, etc., not as Latin dialects, but as Romance languages. There is a forthcoming handbook edited by Christos Didilis, I'm one of the authors. It's forthcoming since 2004. I imagine that most of the authors are getting nervous about the state of affairs. So there is a huge first volume which deals with the state of modern Greek dialectology. It's supposedly more than 1,000 pages. But since I haven't seen it, I can't really tell you what Zizili's opinion about the groupings of the dialects is. So I rearranged the order you find on the website of the Institute for Greek Language, because it wasn't even an alphabetical order. But the reason why I ordered it this way is because, as you can see, and now I'm trying and hoping that nothing changes. I'm screen sharing. Let me see if this works. So Houston, we have technical thing. Okay, now it works. This is the dialect we're going to talk about. These three dialects I mentioned: Pontic, which Romaica is present-day variety which is still spoken in Turkey. These three varieties are very closely related historically, and you can tell by a number of features they have in common. There are a number of other dialects that are somehow related to these dialects. Crimean and Azov Greek, that will interest you. It's possibly that, or perhaps very likely, that this was an early Pontic migration process which brought a variety of Pontic to Russia and Ukraine. There is Syrian Greek, which lies in what used to be the ancient region of Lithuania, which is close to Cappadocia. Some people think it is actually a part of this group, but you also have to take into account that there was a lot of moving around. People were actually moving around. Sometimes whole groups of people were either forced or voluntarily moved around. So it is not easy to actually draw a very precise dialect map of this particular area. Also because we don't have much historical information about many of these dialects in terms of written records. The position of Cypriot is even more complicated. I'm not a specialist in Cypriot Greek, but it definitely has a lot of connections with Asian Minor Greek, which is not, of course, strange if you look at the geographical location. And they were all part of the Eastern Koine in Hellenistic times. So if you would like to know more about the relationship, I would urge you to do some more research. This is a map which I took from a book edited by Angela Rally. The map is due to Io Manolesu, which gives you an idea of where the Asian Minor, the Greek dialects was spoken here. This is a little area in the southeast of Cappadocia, around a town called Varasa or Varassos, as it is also called. This is a different variety. It's actually very different from Cappadocia. The relationship with Pontic was stressed by Dawkins, who said that there was a Pontic mining colony that was established or founded there, but it's very difficult to actually know what the precise relations were, because you can imagine that there was contact between Cappadocia and Farasa over the centuries. So there is also this problem of direct contact, which complicates matters even further. This is Syrians and Lithuania, as I told you. So these are basically the Asian Minor Greek dialects. Like Pontic and Romaic, Cappadocian is characterized by a number of very distinctive archaisms. One of it is the retention of so-called Ionic e. So words which were originally written with the letter eta and corresponding with the long e in ancient Greek, which has become e in most of the dialects due to Ionicism. Appears as in many words, it's more pronounced in Pontic and America, but you find quite a few examples in Cappadocia as well. There are various explanations for it. Some people say this is not a real retention, but it's actually an innovation because it occurs especially in certain environments like liquid sounds. But you also find the word of pirari, perath. The negation me occurs as me in many Cappadocian dialects, sometimes as me. Even a word which you would think would be pronounced with the itacistic pronunciation, ekkisia, in Cappadocia, it's either nekisha or nekisha. My idea is that nekisha was introduced by the kind of by the church, basically, right? So this must be another representation of this phenomenon. But here again, we have this L which might be responsible. Other ionicisms, there is this peculiar phenomenon in Cappadocia that you have a very productive way of forming the imperfect. Not for all the verbs, there are a number of categories that are exempt from this formation, but it is still very, very productive in ish. And a long time ago already, Calvin Watkins pointed to the correspondence of ish and the Homeric, and in fact, not Homeric, it's an Ionic, the East Ionic feature. You find it in Herodotus and in East Ionic inscriptions, this iterative suffix which gives you these remarkable similarities. Homeric actus from and then evolution or which is a form quoted by the Greek grammarians as being Ionic, and you find in Cappadocia Leishken, without the show Leishken, and that's Leishken. These are different variations of the same suffix. Calvin Watkins thought that that was a relationship with the Hittite suffix isk, which has similar functions, but that is very unlikely. James, we talked about this because at the time when there was contact between Greek and Anatolian languages, Luvian was the main language, and Sker had changed to Tser, I think, right? So it's very unlikely that there is a direct connection. But if you think about the colonization of the Black Sea area, then you will probably know that the Black Sea coast of Asia Minor, where the Pontic dialects are found, were settled mainly by Ionic colonizers, especially from Miletus. So they brought their Ionic dialect with them. And this is a very likely source of these Ionic-like remnants in these dialects. And there were definitely trade routes between the Black Sea coast, especially a coastal city like Sinope, to Cappadocia, which was very rich in natural resources. And I assume that there must have been Emporia there where this language contact could have existed. It's important because you find these elements in Cappadocian, even though the Hellenization of Cappadocia, the real Hellenization after the conquest of Alexander, took place rather late, actually during the period when Cappadocia was a kingdom, ruled by an Iranian dynasty by the name of Ariadates. And we know that even in the 4th century, when the Cappadocian church father, Basil the Great, and Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory of Nazianzus lived and wrote and gave the speeches in church, of course, and they used Greek, but they all indirectly refer to the native language that was still spoken in Cappadocia, which must have been the original language. So the substrate language, which I like to think that was Luvian, for which we have indirect evidence. So do we have other archaisms? Yes, we do. Cappadocian doesn't use a relative pronoun, but uses the article to introduce relative clauses. This is a phenomenon you also find in Homer, for instance. So this is another possible Ionic substrate element. The modifiers, number modifiers in Cappadocian have no longer distinctions of gender, so all adjectives, demonstratives, the relative pronouns, they only appear in neutral forms, but they do distinguish singular and plural. The possessive adjectives, Jeff Horrocks calls this an old Asiatic Ionic feature. Now, of course, you find them in many other areas, these possessive adjectives, but they have survived until the present day in both Pontic, Cappadocian, and Parashot. And you can tell by the response from more sort and net, depth, and net. There are very many varieties according to the dialects, but they are clearly recognizable as the ancient forms. And of course, they are also inflected as neuter modifiers. There's still more, yes, we have instead of olos, you find ullo and ulla with the geminate L, it's clearly geminate. With this is an Ionic form. Could be other explanations, of course, but it's mentioned by the people like Cotton as a possible evidence of Ionic influence. And then this is a very good example, I think. The East Ionic negative ukhi is preserved. It's in Pontic. It's one of the negatives, negations in Pontic. In Cappadocian, it's became obsolete in the 19th century. It is mentioned by 19th century philologists who wrote about Cappadocian. Archelaus, one of the earliest native Cappadocians who wrote an ethnographic description with grammatical information, said that it was used alongside then, but Dawkins found no trace of it in around 1910, so it must have disappeared quite early. It is found in some fixed expressions in several dialects, but that can only be explained as an Ionic form. Okay, this is the division, or the traditional division of the Cappadocian dialects. I'm not going to quiz you about the names later on, just to give you an idea. The blue ones are the dialects that are still spoken today, because as Joanna said, Dimitris Papazachariou and myself found speakers of the dialect of Mishtiotica in 2005, but recently it turned out that there are still speakers of the neighboring dialects of Axelitica, and time permitting, I will give you a few examples. They're very closely related, but they sound very different because the differences are particularly notable in the phonology of the dialects, which are very remarkable. This is my interpretation of what Dawkins and others gave us about the division of the dialects. It's basically a geographical division, but there is one special case. This dialect, which is geographically southwest, has a great number of isoglosses in common with the northeast dialect. So geographically southwest, but maybe dialectologically more closely connected to northeast. There is this dialect which is connected to the dialect of east, but that is quite natural because it was a kind of colony, if I may use the ancient word, of people from Mishti who moved and founded this other village of Deer. So that's not really a surprise that they should speak the same dialect. So for a long time, Greek linguists have drawn attention to the northern character of the Asian Minor Greek dialects and Cappadocian in particular. So here you see a number of examples. I tend to use late medieval Greek forms instead of standard modern Greek, because standard modern Greek forms are a form like anthropos. I think that in spoken Greek that must have disappeared quite early. You find anthropos in almost all the dialects. So instead of standard modern Greek examples, I use examples from the grammar of David and Marie and Jeff and a few others. The great grammar of things called medieval and early modern Greek, which is really a very rich source of information for me, and I suppose also for Ioana, because the state of the Greek element in Cappadocian is really late medieval Greek because of the Seljuk invasions in the 12th century. In the 11th century already, it became cut off from the rest of the Greek-speaking world, which more or less froze the state of the Greek language, and it's very archaic in its morphology, archaic in the medieval sense. But it's quite possible that what we perceive now as late medieval Greek, as some people have called it, Briones, like people in the Libys, is in fact actually an even later, earlier form of Greek. Many of these features can be traced back to the Koine period, and it's quite likely that this evolved in a different way and at a different pace than the core Greek dialects, which were shown on the traditional maps. So what you see here is the addition of unstressed E and U, which leads to case syncretism. So Afro becomes Afro, but also the nominative. This is a variant of Athropy. I think it's as common in medieval Greek as Symbiophro. Because of the same process, you get these identical forms for the genitive and the nominative. A few dialects even have this syncope of unstressed. So Afrobus becomes Afrops. Okay, so this looks like a northern type of vocalism. Vowel raising, which is also a very distinctive feature of Northern Greek, you find it in Cappadocia, but almost only in 3 dialects. And the 3 dialects belong to different groups. One is a northern dialect, one is a central dialect, and one is a southern dialect. And the neighboring dialects don't have the vowel raising. So that is a very strange isogloss which runs from north to south, but is not connected to one particular subgroup. Perhaps not as strange as it sounds, because you find often that isoglosses cut across groupings. So in Malakopi, for instance, northwest Cappadocia, instead of Afropos, you have Afropus, Afropus, the accusative, when it's stressed, the O remains, etc. That's something, of course, which is due to the Turkish conquest of the Byzantine Empire, as in Minor in particular. You find Turkish vowels, and some of these vowels you find in Greek words, where they are usually the result of assimilation processes, which leads to raising of certain vowels, and with the result that sometimes they end up sounding like a Turkish vowel. So you find and U in Greek words where there is no Turkish source for it. Of course, in Turkish loan words, you find very many of these Turkish vowels. They have almost all disappeared in the present-day varieties of the 2 Cappadocian dialects that I was talking about, and they have been replaced or assimilated to neighboring sounds in Greek. So, for instance, düşünmek, to think in Turkish, is a very complicated, boring process, and we won't use that, but it comes out in the aorist as düşünse, third person singular, which leads to 2 different present form düşün, düzo originally, but most of the times you find düşün dizo, so it sounds much more like verbs in iso, which are very common, very dramatic suffix iso, or as düşün do or düşün now. If you know this and you are a child learner of Cappadocian, you can turn any Turkish verb into a Greek verb by either using the suffix dizo or the suffix do, right? So you don't need to go through the aorist to form new Cappadocian variants of this. This leads to some very interesting results, as you can see. Turkish should not be visible at this point. This is the inflection of the present indicative of the verb düşmek in its Cappadocian form as spoken in Ulahaj, a very Turkish-side village in southeast Cappadocia. And if you look at the forms, you see that what should come out as düşündüm with the Greek and or düşündüm with the Greek and the Cappadocian Greek and you see a kind of vowel harmony. The harmony extends to the end, so düşündüm and düşündüm. Now, this is something it is rarely attested. At least Dawkins only gives a few examples of it, and in later descriptions of the dialect, you find no traces of it. But it stands to reason to assume that it must have been a very normal thing happening in a situation where speakers were fluent bilinguals. It leads to a very interesting situation. If you look at the reflective past, which is more or less equivalent to the aorist in Greek, you see that you find identical forms. The third person singular of the reflective past in Turkish is düşündüm, which is the same as the first person singular of the present indicative, and the second singular of the reflective past as the third singular of the present indicative in Ulahaj. I don't think there will have been any communicative problems because you would either speak Turkish or Cappadocian Greek. So it's a coincidence, but it was too nice not to show you the coincidence. This is a bit complicated. Here you have a type of inflection in late medieval Greek. And if you look at, it's too complicated to give you all the variations on the inflection of the inherited masculine O stems, but there are a number of things you will immediately notice. There are two doublets here. There seems to be two nominatives in the singular and the plural. Now, actually, this is not a nominative, but it's accusative, and this is reclusive as well, because Cappadocian distinguishes between, and this is undoubtedly a Turkish feature, between definite and indefinite objects. So if you see, I saw the man, either to atropo, that would be the accusative, but I saw a man, you would say either ena athropos. It's a nominative. This is a kind of replication of the Turkish pattern where the nominative and the indefinite accusative are not marked for case, and the definite accusative is marked for case. And in Cappadocian, it's the other way around. It's more marking the nominative and less in the accusative. So it's the pattern that has been replicated. You also notice that there are doubles here, these forms with you and use and you. They are a puzzle to linguists, which is nice because I like this type of puzzles, like real puzzles, but I like other kind of puzzles. I think if you look at the system with all these deleted, unstressed us and is, which lead to syncretism in the system, there is a tension, and there is a tendency to resolve this problem by adding actually the original ending of the accusative. So there was a period when there was no accusative used, and for masculine nouns, nominative and accusative, some dialects were identical. And for neuter nouns, the accusative form would be used in the nominative. This is interesting because this is a phenomenon you find in Anatolian languages. So it could be that this is an example of substrate influence, but there is so much language contact in Mixed Minor that it's very difficult to argue for either one of these explanations. But if you add the ending, and then of course the deleted unstressed E is undeleted, you get athropius and athropiu and often deleted. And then by regular synesthesis, you get athropius and athropiu, or athropiun, right? So I think that these are innovations which came about because of a stage in the language where the nominative and accusative plural were identical. And there was a need to find, to fill the gaps. And that was by just reusing all the endings There are other examples in modern varieties which are very interesting if you like to hear them. This could be on the analogy of the genitive plural, because the N is found sometimes, very, very rarely, final N is very weak, but this could then be just on the analogy of the plural, where you find this other genitive in the singular. My interpretation of this system is that what you basically see there, and that's why I call it a late medieval development, you see a kind of agglutinative inflection. So in the plural, you get the ending of the nominative accusative, which have become identical. There was this E, which was deleted, of course, if nothing followed it. And then you could add case endings to this system. You can see this much more clearly in inflection with feminine now. And you see the inflection as it appears in North Cappadocian, but this is Southeast Cappadocian, and here you see exactly the same phenomenon. You have the singular inflection, where you have nominative accusative, which are identical, separate genitive ending here. This is definitely not any inherited Greek ending. It's the same you find in the masculine, and of course, especially in the neuter diminutives, which explains probably its productivity and frequency. But if you look at the plural, you have here the plural marker, here the case marker. If you look at the Turkish equivalents, you can actually see that it's almost a one-to-one, and if you like zero endings, linguists often like zero endings, then you could say, well, here the number feature is empty, and the case feature is empty and nominative, the definite accusative. Here you have genitive, etc. And some Greek linguists have actually interpreted the A, or reinterpreted the A in this particular case as a number marker and no longer as part of the stem of this this word. It's rather attractive, I think, because it looks so nice. This is another example. This is there are only two dialects which have more or less the Greek form of the imperfect of the verb to be, and with the Greek endings, etc. But in most of the other dialects, you find an entirely different system. This is from Axor. The stressed initial syllable is only used when the verb is not clitic. You have clitic forms. And as you can see, with the exception of the third person plural, all these forms are reanalyzed on the basis of the third person singular. Now, those of you who can see the endings, not the zero, but it's true. I mean, in Turkish, this is a Turkish type inflection. Yes, I will show you right now. This is the equivalent. They also have clitic, non-clitic forms. The capitals are used because there is vowel harmony, so the vowels can change according to the different environments they have. But you see that the system is basically the Turkish system. You take the third person singular, you reanalyze it not as a stem with an ending, but as a new stem. Then you can end the personal endings, which you will recognize, of course, as Greek endings. And the only exception in most dialects is the third person singular, and this makes sense because this is a phenomenon which is not found in Turkish only, but in quite a few languages. And it is called, the phenomenon is called Watkins' law, because Calvin Watkins described how in many languages the third person singular is used to reanalyze the inflection of verbs with new endings, exactly along the lines of this type. This is even more spectacular. This is a vowel-raising dialect. You can tell by the map set, you can read and see. And here you see that the Turkish endings have been added to the Greek endings. And this occurs only in vowel-raising dialects. And why is this? Because the T looks like the Turkish suffix for the past, the perfective past, which is D or T. And I think that somehow by using this T in the ending, it was by people who were so fluent, predominantly fluent in Turkish, that they felt the need to add this person ending. You find it in different dialects, but only in the first person plural and the second person plural, because that's where this T element ends up. So that is quite spectacular to look at. I'm almost there. Some syntactic observations. Cappadocian is an SOV typology language, like Turkish. It doesn't mean that SOV is the basic word order. Actually, I think SVO is as common in Cappadocian as SOV, but the typology is the same. And that means that all the modifiers all precede the noun, and you cannot find any examples except in present-day Cappadocian dialects, because then there is interference from Greek. But in the older variants, you always find the nominal modifiers in pre-nominal position, which is especially obvious in examples like that I said in Neckersnoem, Neckar van wat, of my wife and father, but that is the Neckars vrienden, Jordashi, Neckar van wat. That would be difficult to say in Greek in this order. This is a relative clause preceding the headline. Okay, so what is zelfs van Marokko will then declare die mannen dan being busy. Tot declare het schach is van Marokko, mannen busy dan tot being. Now the interesting thing is that whereas the position of the relative clause is Turkish, it's preverb, non-note, preceding the head. The internal makeup of the relative clause is still Greek. If you would have a clitic pronoun within a relative clause, it will be attracted to the relative pronoun, which is a very ancient phenomenon on which I will not go into now. I want to bother with that now. I'm almost there. I just want to give you two examples of, or one example, is the same example of the two dialects which are still spoken. They say exactly the same, but if you look at it, I will read them to you, you will immediately notice the differences. Ishi taxenitica analistami. Do you speak axenitica? With me being the Turkish interrogative particle, which is still used in the dialect, and also the word order is quite, it's still quite Cappadocian. So, and Mishotica, it sounds very different. Ishi da Mishotica Galajevistami. So, you see that Mishotica, can you see in this example, not yet. This dialect has vowel raising and palatalization, whereas Axenitica doesn't have it. You will notice it in a minute. I don't speak it well, Axenitica, but if you talk to a Mishoris, you say, oh, then that Galajev. I was toying with the critics because their position varies. I talked about that yesterday. This example should be, it should be here and not here. Oh, then I don't speak it very well. This is a Turkish verb. And la law, of course, is the Greek verb, which so there's a different lexical choice in these dialects. But I understand it tiny little bit. And that is a Turkish verb. It's different here. But I understand it a little bit. Yavaş yavaş, Mahmud'a, siga siga. Tomasello. In Cappadocian, you can't say yavaş yavaş. You would more often hear yara yara. Yara yara, Mahmud'a. Same verb with the shorter calm. These fricatives tend to disappear very easily into the correct positions. Takakales ketaneges, the iayades, the ikineges. You see, they have the neuter article. They only do it with women. The men have no article in the nominative. So the the yayas and the women. Here it's dakakais, cheap dimensions. Here you see an example of how different a word sounds in Mishodika as compared to Aksinika, as a vowel raising, and as a result, the palatalization of the feeler, and this is, and also very obviously in kya, which becomes chi. There are Aksinika, there's one left in Crete, where they have it in contact with Crete, where they do it with, they say cha instead of kya. But that's a result of contact with the Cretan, local Cretan violence. They speak it the best of all, that's true. If you work on these languages, I don't know about America, but my best speakers are elderly or very old women. They have the same meaning. And if you want to know what the critics feel, they are post-verbal, that's the normal position. They can be attracted in preverbal position by negatives, or optionally by focused constituents. That was one of the topics of my talk yesterday. These are two pictures of the eldest informants. This happy puppy looks very healthy, smoking. He's in his 90s, can you believe it? And this was my favorite, Mishodika speaking Kakadebika. She died at the age of 103. And she was really a beautiful speaker. And I wish I had made more recordings of her. And that is what you say at the end of your talk. And Kyoros asas harish. Kyoros asas harish. As harish and the Mishodika. God bless you, but it simply means thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. It was a great presentation. I've got many questions, but by no means will I dominate the question time. Please ask Mark whatever he likes. He has worked extensively on language content, as we have seen, Hellenistic substrate. So I'm sure he would be delighted to take questions.
Presumably you have to deposit a stage post-coining when the Asian Minor dialects were still connected to other dialects. That would then explain why you've got some common features in other autumn medieval Greek with what you showed us today. For example, the use of the bits of the article as a relative pronoun. That is pretty well common in
Of course, yes.
medieval Greek.
Yeah.
The language was the whole ulos or holos, which again is not limited to the
No,
it's vowels, of course. So that was, I would have thought, go back to a stage and possibly be dependent on an Ionic legacy, a form which has survived from Ionic.
Now the two obviously also contribute to each other. It's very difficult to see whether certain phenomena are the result of convergence between adjacent dialects, and also because of all these migrations of the Byzantine Empire, populations were moved about all the time, and then again in the Ottoman Empire the same thing happened. So that makes it even more difficult, especially because we don't have written records. I believe that in your grammar of medieval Greek, one of the problems is to pinpoint the geographical distribution of certain variations that you find with the exception of Pontic. I'm sure in Cypriot where you have more evidence. But the problem is that I wouldn't say that the Greek state of affairs coincides very well with a lot of the not the innovations, but the parts of medieval Greek which preserve earlier stages. Okay, so it's very difficult to prove whether we are actually dealing with a kind of conservative area, or whether this is a state of affairs that was just left unchanged from the Collingham period, right? And the same goes with these ionic elements, that there are conflicting explanations. You can explain the retention of ionic air as a phonologically conditioned phenomenon. But you find it in other environments as well. So it's really very difficult to go for either one or the other. I simply listed the most obvious connections. In Pontic, you have, I think, many more examples of ionic features, but that makes sense because of the fact that that was the area that was colonized by ionic speakers in the first place. A form like Inca or Inika, that we find definitely ionic forms in remote dialects in the Pontic area as well. But as I said, it is really very difficult because of these constant population movements to know when an innovative feature entered the region or whether it was an internal development. The same holds, by the way, for a phenomenon like what is called differential object marking, when you have a definite interpret. It's a little bit more complicated because it has to do with specificity as well. Cappadocian, it's difficult to distinguish between specific and definite objects per se, because we don't have enough examples of it. Most of our data were folk tales that were recorded by earlier Latin poets, because that was the way that Latin poetry was done. We didn't do so conversational recordings, you have recording material. But you have a very peculiar type of texts on which to work with, and you only have what you have. And now when you try to elicit data from speakers, it's very difficult because some of these speakers, I have one informant who's really very good, but he's a Turkologist. So he will actually Turkify or Turkicize his Cappadocian perhaps even more than it used to be before the population exchange. That is also a problem of your informants. Then most of them are, they use Greek all the time, and even elderly people, when they, especially the men, when they speak, when you ask them to speak Cappadocian, it's like as if they speak Greek and use some Cappadocian words in it. Or the other way around, it's very difficult to disentangle the two. So Catalaba, they use it all the time, and if I say Anglecha, Catalaba, they will slap me on the shoulder because he knows the real ones. That's nice to be able to show off to the speakers every time. Adam, you also have a question.
Yeah, thanks for a great talk. I wanted to ask you about the differential object marking. So definites get accusative and definites get nominative. Does that also apply if they occur in subject function? We get the same version. So if you had a definite subject, would that be marked accusative?
Well, we have examples of this in Pontic, where when you use the article, you see an accusative form. You find it in the Pontic translation of Asterix, is Asterikos, indefinite, but or Astericum with the nominative N. This is often explained as a confusion of the old ancient Greek words in on with omega. But you find that in Pontic in particular. But you find confusion. So you find a definite nominative sometimes with the article and without the S. But it's really, I only have so many, very few examples of this. But I'm sure it played a role. And also, the S was at some point clearly associated with indefiniteness because you cannot also use it with neuter nouns. So if you go to a well, if you go to the well, so perav, I'm going to stop peravi. If you go to a well, you can say sena peravis. And this S is doing nothing there, it's just signaling indefiniteness. So there must have been speakers who were able to actually reanalyze these endings as one element being particularly specifically used to mark definiteness or indefiniteness in this particular case.
Yes, exactly.
Not so certain that E-score, the suffix E-score, is retention of the Ionian feature. Because E-score can be found in Northern Greece, it can be found in Cyprus, and it's clearly non-Ionian speaking areas.
Definitely.
But I noticed the differences in those dialects. E-score is attached to effective stem, so Pethan E-score.
Yeah.
Also, in yours, that's the E-score, which of course is the imperfect stem.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true, and I know, and you find the same phenomenon. Bethano in Cappadocian is there are doubles. Bethanisco, you find exactly the same examples, but there we're talking about present formations, right? So the present and is very common. Here you have all these verbs where it's not there in the present. Leo, Beno for Bigano, Pero, and Berishka, essentially. So it is specifically productive, or very productive in imperfect formations. And in the other dialects, my impression is that it's not coming from the imperfect, but that it was used for imperfective formation in general. So the present and the imperfect just simply have the same suffix, and it was a suffix which you find in ancient Greek verbs as well. The Dasko also has it, where you cannot possibly claim that it had iterative functions there. But yes, of course, I know that. So thank you for the observation. It's a conspiracy, I think.
Any more questions? Then I think we should.
I was expecting one from you.
What's so many? It's actually perhaps I can allow myself to pose one question. I would like to go back, since you definitely want a question from me. I would like to go back to the sort of emergence point for Asia Minor Greek and the connection and the relationship between the different Asia Minor Greek varieties. So I'm not sure when you were, I think, replying to David, I'm not exactly sure if I understood your sort of position. So you're assuming a localized koine, but what is the sort of directionality? Do you have any sort of hypothesis? Is it kind of a Pontic from Pontus to Cappadocia, from Cappadocia to Pontus? Could it be how do you envisage the relationship between these varieties?
Yeah.
And what is a sort of a split point if we assume that there's a kind of a common source?
So if our sources are correct in actually telling us that there was a substrate language which was still spoken in common times. We have various references that people who traveled to Cappadocia needed interpreters to be able to communicate with the locals. That would not have been in the cities, obviously, but in the rural areas, you needed an interpreter. We have the Cappadocian fathers who directly or indirectly refer to them. Gregory of Nyssa says that the word for heaven was not uranos in Cappadocian. So then it can't have been a Greek dialect. I'm pretty sure that no Greek dialect in Christian area would use another word for heaven except uranos. Unfortunately, he doesn't tell us what it is. He gives the Latin word and the Hebrew word, but he doesn't give the Cappadocian word, which is really a shame. Okay, so that means that the Hellenization was, especially of the rural areas, was a very slow process. So that took place in Hellenistic and Roman times. Okay, now where do these Ionic elements come from? They can't have possibly come from the koine in itself, because it had Ionic elements, but not these particular elements. So is there a possibility that there were pre-koine settlements in Cappadocia, which came from Pontus, kind of permanent trading places of sorts for which we have no evidence, so it's pure speculation. Or were these contacts still going on in Koine times? The similarities between Pontic and Cappadocian are really very substantial. So there must have been, if not a continuous a dialect continuum, there must have been very, frequent and strong contacts between the two areas. But I hesitate to actually, maybe you have.
I do, but I think it is justified to be hesitating. Actually, I think it's perhaps at some points there was a kind of a flux or contact, but there were also some sort of discontinuity points, which we need anyway to account for the important differences between the varieties. I mean, between the Pontic ones and the Cappadocian, because as you say, they share a lot of stuff, but they are quite different in other ways. So I think it is safe to say that there was a contact, but not a constant flux, as you said. I wouldn't assume a constant flux, also because of geography. The geography doesn't help much.
Definitely, yeah.
Well,
Just not something.
yes, please.
Mark, I would like to thank you for your dedication, for the work you have done for the Greek dialects, the Greek culture. I'm sorry, people, you do not know me. I'm the former ambassador of Greece in Belgium. So with Mark, we had the chance to work together to relate to organize things. And believe me, thank you very much. It's an honor. It's a pleasure. Coming from, I have served in Russia a long time ago. So I noticed today that we have discussed that similarity that you mentioned now between Pontic and Cappadocian. So I noticed many words, Kalatsevo, which are similar. So these words exist in the Pontic language.
And also in the
Again, thank you for your dedication. Thank you, and thank you all of you, because we belong psychologically, sentimentally, culturally speaking, we belong to the new world.
And on this note, I think we can conclude today's fascinating presentation. We thank Mark once again.
thank you.